What if a single court decision could quietly change the future of hundreds of thousands of people already living, working, and building their lives in the United States? A 6-3 Supreme Court ruling has now opened the door for the federal government to end certain temporary immigration protections, programs that many families have relied on for years to stay legally in the country. For some, this isn't just policy debate. It's the difference between stability and sudden uncertainty. These protections were never meant to last forever, but over time they became a lifeline for people who came seeking safety, opportunity, or simply a chance to work without fear. Now, with this ruling, the balance of power has shifted, and immigration policy may be heading into one of its most significant turning points in recent years. What does this actually mean for workers, families, and employers across the U.S.? Who could be affected first, and how quickly could changes begin to roll out? These are the questions millions are now asking as legal experts, policymakers, and communities react to the decision. In this video, we'll break down what the ruling really says, who is most at risk, and what it could mean for the future of immigration in America, without the confusion or legal jargon. If you want clear answers and real insight into how this decision could impact everyday lives, make sure to stay with us. And don't forget to like this video so more people can understand what's really happening. To understand the real weight of this 6-3 Supreme Court ruling, we need to slow things down and look at what is actually changing in practical terms, not just in headlines or social media reactions. Because behind the legal language and court terminology, there is a very real shift in how immigration protections can be created, maintained, and removed in the United States. And for many people, especially those living under temporary protected status programs, that shift doesn't feel abstract at all. It feels personal, uncertain, and deeply tied to everyday life. At the center of this discussion is something known as temporary protected status, often called TPS. This is a legal protection that allows individuals from certain countries facing conflict, natural disasters, or unsafe conditions to live and work legally in the United States for a limited period of time. It was never designed as a permanent pathway to citizenship, but over the years, for many families, it has become exactly that in practice. People have built careers, raised children, bought homes, and contributed to their communities while living under this status, often renewing it repeatedly as conditions in their home countries remain unstable. What this Supreme Court ruling signals, according to legal interpretation trends, is a stronger recognition of executive authority when it comes to ending or limiting these temporary programs. In simpler terms, it suggests that the federal government may have broader power to decide when these protections are no longer necessary, even if that decision affects large groups of people who have been living under them for years. And that is where the tension begins. Because while the law sees these programs as temporary by definition, real life often evolves in ways that make temporary feel like something much more permanent. Now, to really grasp why this matters, it's important to understand how immigration policy in the United States has always been shaped by a balance of power. Congress writes immigration laws, the executive branch enforces them, and the courts step in when there is disagreement over interpretation. Over time, this balance shifts depending on political leadership and judicial philosophy. A 6-3 court composition generally reflects a more conservative-leaning judicial approach, which often emphasizes stricter readings of statutory authority and greater deference to executive power in certain administrative decisions. So when people hear about a ruling that appears to give the government more authority to end temporary immigration protections, what they are really hearing is the result of that balance shifting. It doesn't necessarily mean that protections will disappear overnight, but it does mean that legal challenges against termination decisions may become harder to win. Courts may be more likely to say that these are policy decisions left to the executive branch, rather than issues for judicial intervention. For individuals under TPS or similar protections, this introduces a new layer of uncertainty. Many have already experienced cycles of renewal decisions, court injunctions, and policy changes across different administrations. Each cycle brings hope, anxiety, and long periods of waiting. But what makes this moment feel different for many observers is the perception that legal pathways to challenge sudden termination could be narrowing. That doesn't automatically translate into immediate deportations or abrupt changes, but it does reshape the legal environment in which future decisions will be made. To put it in more human terms, imagine building your life around something that has always been renewed, always extended, always assumed to continue in some form. And then suddenly, the legal safety net that supported that expectation becomes less secure. Even if nothing changes immediately, the psychological impact is significant. People begin to reconsider long-term plans, employers begin to question workforce stability, and communities start to anticipate outcomes that are still uncertain but now feel more possible. At the same time, it is important to separate legal interpretation from political messaging. Court rulings like this are often discussed in very dramatic terms, especially online, where phrases like massive ruling or historic shift can sometimes exaggerate the immediate real-world effects. The reality is usually more complex and slower moving. Implementation depends on federal agencies, administrative procedures, and sometimes additional litigation that can take years to resolve fully. However, the direction of legal reasoning still matters. If courts are increasingly deferring to the executive branch in matters of temporary immigration protections, future administrations may have more flexibility to both end and redesign these programs. That flexibility can cut both ways. One administration might choose to expand protections, while another might choose to scale them back more aggressively. In that sense, the ruling doesn't just affect one group of people. It reshapes the long-term structure of how immigration policy is managed. Another important aspect that often gets overlooked in public discussion is the economic impact tied to temporary protected populations. Many individuals under these programs are not just residents, they are essential workers in industries such as healthcare support, construction, hospitality, agriculture, and transportation. Their legal status allows them to contribute to the economy in structured and taxable ways. When uncertainty increases around that status, employers may face labor instability, and workers may face difficult decisions about whether to stay, relocate, or change industries entirely. This creates a ripple effect that extends beyond immigration policy itself. Local economies, especially in areas with high concentrations of protected status holders, can feel the impact through staffing shortages, reduced consumer spending, and increased turnover. These are not immediate consequences of a court ruling, but they are the kinds of downstream effects that policymakers and economists often monitor closely when legal frameworks begin to shift. On the human side, families living under temporary protection often exist in a state of long-term planning under short-term certainty. They make decisions one renewal cycle at a time, which affects everything from education to housing to financial investment. A shift in legal interpretation doesn't erase their lives or contributions, but it does influence how secure those plans feel moving forward. It is also worth noting that legal experts frequently emphasize that Supreme Court rulings rarely operate in isolation. They become part of a broader legal ecosystem that includes federal agencies, lower courts, and future cases that refine or expand the original decision. So, while the headline may suggest a decisive change, the actual implementation often unfolds gradually through a series of administrative actions and legal interpretations over time. For viewers trying to make sense of all this, the most important thing to understand is that immigration law in the United States is not a single fixed system. It is constantly evolving through legislation, executive action, and judicial review. What feels like a sudden shift is often the result of long-developing legal debates finally reaching a resolution point in the courts. And in this case, the key takeaway is not just about whether temporary protections can be ended, but about how much authority the government has to make that decision, and how limited judicial intervention may become in reviewing it. That distinction is subtle, but it is extremely important for understanding what comes next. As this ruling continues to be discussed and interpreted, attention will likely turn toward how federal agencies choose to apply it. Will there be immediate policy changes, or will adjustments be gradual and targeted? Will Congress respond with new legislation to redefine or stabilize temporary protection programs? These are the questions that will shape the next phase of this issue, far more than the court decision alone. For now, what we are seeing is a legal foundation being clarified in a way that could influence immigration policy for years to come. not through sudden disruption, but through a gradual shift in how decisions are made, challenged, and enforced. And that is why this ruling has drawn so much attention. It doesn't just affect one policy, it affects the structure behind how that policy can change in the future. If there is one thing to take away from all of this, it is that the story is still unfolding. Legal rulings set boundaries, but within those boundaries, governments still have choices, administrations still set priorities, and laws still evolve. The impact of this decision will ultimately depend not only on what the court said, but on how it is used going forward. And if you want to stay informed about how these changes develop and what they actually mean in real life, not just in headlines, make sure you continue following along, because the next updates could be just as important as the ruling itself. Continuing from where we left off, it's important to go even deeper into what this kind of ruling means when it starts interacting with real-world systems, like immigration courts, federal agencies, and local governments. Because while the Supreme Court sets the legal boundaries, the actual impact only becomes visible when those boundaries are tested in day-to-day governance. And that is where things often become less predictable and more complicated for the people directly affected. One of the first areas where changes tend to show up is in administrative decision-making. Federal agencies responsible for immigration enforcement and processing are the ones who interpret how a ruling is applied in practice. Even when a Supreme Court decision does not explicitly order immediate changes to existing programs, it can still reshape internal guidance. That means officers, supervisors, and policy divisions may begin adjusting how they evaluate extensions, renewals, or terminations of temporary protections. These shifts are not always announced with dramatic headlines, but they can gradually change outcomes over time. For individuals under temporary protection, this creates a kind of invisible transition period. On paper, their status may still be valid, but the environment around that status can begin to feel different. Renewal timelines might be reviewed more strictly. Eligibility standards might be interpreted with less flexibility. Documentation requirements might become more detailed or more frequently updated. None of these changes necessarily happen overnight, but together they can signal a tightening of the system. At the same time, immigration attorneys and advocacy groups often begin closely monitoring how the ruling is being cited in lower court cases. This is because Supreme Court decisions don't just resolve one dispute, they often become reference points in future legal arguments. Lawyers on both sides will study the language of the ruling to understand how far its reasoning can be extended. In cases involving termination of protections, like TPS, the key question becomes whether courts will continue to defer to executive discretion, or whether there are still meaningful legal limits that can be enforced. What makes this particularly significant is that immigration law is one of the most frequently litigated areas in federal courts. That means the effects of a single Supreme Court decision can ripple outward quickly as it gets tested in multiple jurisdictions. One federal appeals court might interpret the ruling broadly, while another might apply it more narrowly. This can create a patchwork of legal standards that affects people differently depending on where they live in the United States. For example, someone living in one state might find that challenges to their immigration status are handled with stricter deference to federal authority, while someone in another jurisdiction might still benefit from stronger judicial scrutiny. This uneven application is not uncommon in U.S. law, but it becomes especially impactful in immigration cases, where people's ability to live and work legally can depend on these interpretations. Beyond the legal system, there is also the question of how communities respond socially and economically. When large groups of people are living under temporary protection, they are often deeply integrated into local economies. They work in hospitals, schools, construction sites, restaurants, warehouses, and transportation networks. Many have children who are U.S. citizens attending public schools. They pay rent or mortgages, contribute to local businesses, and participate in community life in very tangible ways. So when uncertainty increases, even without immediate policy changes, it can affect behavior across entire communities. Some families may begin to save more aggressively, preparing for potential changes in status. Others may delay major financial decisions, like buying homes or starting new businesses. Employers, especially in labor-dependent industries, may start planning for higher turnover or increased hiring uncertainty. These reactions are often gradual, but they can accumulate into broader economic effects over time. It's also important to understand that temporary protected populations are not a uniform group. They come from different countries, different backgrounds, and different circumstances. Some have been in the United States for a few years, while others have lived here for decades under continuous renewals. This diversity means that the impact of any policy change or court ruling does not land evenly. Some individuals may be closer to alternative pathways for permanent residency, while others may have fewer legal options available, depending on their circumstances. That uneven reality is part of what makes immigration policy so complex. It is not just about categories or statutes. It is about individual life stories that intersect with those legal categories in very different ways. A ruling that appears straightforward in legal terms can produce a wide range of outcomes, depending on each person's situation. Another layer to consider is the political environment surrounding immigration decisions. Supreme Court rulings often become part of broader national debates, especially when they involve issues that are already politically sensitive. Immigration policy in the United States has long been one of those areas where legal interpretation and political opinion are deeply intertwined. As a result, decisions like this one are often discussed not only in legal circles, but also in legislative hearings, media coverage, and public discourse. That public attention can sometimes influence how quickly or cautiously executive agencies move in response. Even when a ruling provides legal authority to take certain actions, policymakers may still consider timing, implementation strategy, and public reaction. This means that the real-world effects of a ruling are often shaped not just by law, but by political judgment and administrative discretion. From a long-term perspective, one of the most significant implications of this ruling is how it may affect future immigration programs. If courts continue to affirm broad executive authority over temporary protections, future administrations may have more flexibility to design similar programs without needing extensive legislative approval. That could lead to a system where immigration protections are more responsive to changing conditions in other countries, but also more vulnerable to policy shifts between administrations. This creates a structural tension. On one hand, flexibility allows the government to respond quickly to crises, such as wars, natural disasters, or political instability abroad. On the other hand, frequent changes in policy can create instability for individuals who rely on those protections to build stable lives in the United States. Balancing these two realities is one of the central challenges of modern immigration governance. Legal scholars often describe this as the difference between temporary humanitarian protection and long-term integration policy. Temporary programs are designed to respond to immediate conditions, but when they last for many years, they begin to function more like long-term residency systems in practice. That evolution creates pressure on lawmakers and courts to clarify whether these programs should remain temporary in nature or be formalized into more permanent pathways. This Supreme Court ruling does not settle that debate, but it does influence the framework in which that debate will continue. By reinforcing executive authority, it may reduce the likelihood of courts intervening in decisions to end or modify these programs. That shifts more responsibility onto political branches of government, meaning Congress and the President will play a larger role in determining the future direction of immigration protections. For individuals following this issue closely, one of the most important things to watch going forward is how consistent federal policy remains across different administrations. If future governments frequently change the status or availability of temporary protections, the system will likely continue to generate uncertainty. If, however, there is movement toward more stable legislative solutions, that could reduce volatility and create clearer long-term expectations. In the meantime, legal experts often emphasize the importance of staying informed about official updates, rather than relying on speculation or fragmented information. Immigration policy is highly technical, and small changes in legal interpretation can have large consequences over time. That is why clarity from trusted legal sources, government announcements, and court documents becomes especially important in moments like this. What we can say with confidence is that this ruling represents a meaningful development in how authority over temporary immigration protections is understood within the U.S. legal system. It strengthens the role of the executive branch, narrows the space for judicial intervention in certain contexts, and sets the stage for future policy decisions that could have wide-reaching effects. But what it does not do is instantly change the lives of those currently living under these protections. Instead, it begins a process, one that will unfold through policy decisions, legal challenges, and administrative implementation over time. That process will determine how significant this ruling ultimately becomes in shaping the future of immigration in the United States. And as that process continues, the most important thing for viewers is to stay aware of how each new development fits into the bigger picture. Because in issues like this, the headlines may capture attention, but the real impact is always found in the details that follow. If you've been following along to understand not just what the ruling says, but what it actually means in practice, then staying updated as the situation evolves will be essential. And as always, keeping informed is the best way to understand how changes like this could eventually affect communities, families, and the broader immigration system in the months and years ahead.